What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from the altar again, and this time we are here with Crow Lotus of the Almighty Capra. It is so great to be able to talk with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's so awesome to have you here. I actually had Tyler come on the show before you were releasing In Transmission, but now we got the
Oh,
new Errors album coming out, which is absolutely kick-ass. Way to top the album. There was a lot of expectations and big shoes to fill, and you completely outdid yourself. But for people who haven't heard the full album yet, do you feel like the first singles that we heard, such as Tied Up and Human Commodity, is maybe like a good representation of what this whole record will sound like, or is that just one little taste of what's to come?
it's kind of a tough one because I feel like, yes, in a way, like it shows kind of the direction that we're moving toward. But I do feel like we were like a little bit more experimental with this album. So there are some songs that are kind of, I don't want to say out of left field because it's all within the same vein, but they're definitely different from one another. So certain songs have a little bit of a different character to them. So I think that'll be definitely interesting to hear what people's opinions are on that.
Being that you mentioned that this is more experimental, was there sort of like a vision that revolved around the making of this album, or was it or like a very roll of the dice songwriting process where there wasn't you weren't really confined to a specific vision or goal?
I think it's more of maybe it was things that we weren't so sure if we wanted to put on the first album, or maybe we were just a little bit nervous to try something different or something that was out of our comfort zone. So I think after how the first album was received, maybe we had a little bit of a confidence boost. So we were like, okay, let's just try it out. Let's have these riffs that we weren't sure about and just go ahead and move forward with them. And I definitely had some lyrical content that I had to build up a little bit of courage to be able to talk about. And maybe it's something that a lot of people, it's kind of like more about my personal life. So I think maybe a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand it right away. But for me, it was pretty vulnerable to be able to talk about those things.
I've noticed that there was you hit the nail on the head when it came with that word vulnerable. I've noticed that there was like an essence of vulnerability on this album, and it felt like it was more raw with its emotion. Not to say that In Transmission wasn't raw, but I
For
felt
sure.
like there was like a lot of different external and internal subject matter to be involved. But before we get more into the lyrics, would Errors almost be considered like, for lack of better words, like the sequel, or just like the continuation of In Transmission? Or were you kind of like burying the past and more focusing on, like making a new beginning for Capra?
Right. I really like the first album, so don't get me wrong, but I will say that I think that this album is a little bit closer to what I wanted the first album to sound like, I'd say. I'm pretty happy with how it is. I'd say, like, honestly, lyrically, yeah, it probably is pretty much a sequel. A lot of the things that I talk about in the first album is kind of almost like an expansion on that. But at the same time, I think that like that could be said about probably any band's like second album is more of a sequel of just like who they are as people and as musicians. So I think that that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, like they say, you have your whole first life. You have your whole life to make your first album, but the rest of your life to do it again. I do think In Transmission hit the ground running. I think it paved like a frictionless path to what we would later see on Errors. That's how I sort of looked at it.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
With the lyrical concept, you mentioned that this was more personal in a way, and you mentioned you needed to sort of work up the courage to do that. I think anytime an artist has to like look withinward and utilize courage in order to express a personal side to them is always truly admirable. Was there almost kind of like a pinnacle moment, maybe from the In Transmission era, that made you realize, okay, I'm ready to sing about these subject matters now, or was it just kind of like letting it happen more over time as you gain more experience?
I think it was that I kind of there were certain things that I touched on in the first album. And I guess I don't know what I expected, but I had never like really released an album to kind of like the level of or the number of people that we did with Capra before. So I don't know what I expected, like people to message me and say, hey, what was like this song, was this about this specific like instance in your life? But that's just not a thing. Like people don't know, all the ins and outs. They don't know all the little specific details about your life. So you can kind of get away with talking about almost anything. And maybe like somebody who knows you will hear it and be like, I can't believe you wrote about that. But really, that's just not something that happens. So I said I might as well just write about really anything because nobody's going to even know what I'm talking about probably anyway. So
I
that
thought
was where my head was.
I thought your lyrics definitely show, because I consider Capra to be a real like relentless hardcore band in a way. I think it has all the elements of aggression in it, but I think you also show that it's okay to be a hardcore band and express an essence of vulnerability. This isn't like to knock on hardcore. I love that music, but sometimes there is sort of like a facade of toughness in a way where like it almost seems like oh, you shouldn't cry or express your broken heart in a hardcore, otherwise you're just a cheesy metalcore band. But I think like you showed strength with vulnerability and errors.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've always considered myself to be a pretty like emotional. I don't want to say emotional person, but somebody who's very comfortable being emotional. Just because I think that it's a lot more. I'm not sure. I think that it's just a lot easier to be able to be in touch with that side of yourself. And I think that a lot of people go around being afraid to admit how they feel or being afraid to feel anything at all. And I think that that can just be like a really exhausting life.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like it could be exhausting one way or another. Keeping those emotions bottled in is definitely something that's deteriorating, but also maybe having to use it as a fuel behind the fire. There's a lot of times where, people use those, either those demons or those traumas, and they kind of fly too close to the sun with it.
Very true.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
Have you always preferred to have the music before you came up with lyrics, or have you approached Tyler and the rest of the band being like, okay, this is what I want to sing about, and maybe that helped guide the sound of the music?
So me and Candace from Walls of Jericho like had a live recently and talked about like a little bit about the writing process. Somebody had asked us about that, and I found that like our processes were very similar. And I'm curious to know if like other vocalists do the same thing. But basically, what I did before is because when I joined the band, they had already written some songs, and I was going to change the lyrics because they already had a previous vocalist, and I just didn't want to sing somebody else's lyrics. And so what I had done for the first album was I just listened to the music until I like could just like write to it. So I would just play the song kind of over and over, and then just eventually just start like writing something. But now what I do is I will usually have kind of a list of different topics that I want to talk about. And then I'll listen to because usually they write it and then just record it on their phones or something, listen to it. And then I'll be like, which of these like topics does it feel like it invokes more? So like maybe I'll have something that's like a bit of a lighter topic, or something that's maybe a little bit heavier, or something that's a little bit darker. And then I'm like, does this lyric invoke something that's a little bit darker, or something that's like maybe just not as heavy? And so I'll just like choose a topic from there. And then that's whenever I'll just kind of like essentially just write. I used to write to the music. Now I just try to just write as much as I can. So I'll try to write like maybe 2 pages of just like prose, and then I'll listen to the music and I'll kind of just like change the prose to fit to the I guess rhythm of the music, if that makes any sense.
That definitely does. I like how you have sort of like a technical method behind the madness in a way, because sometimes
I have to.
Sometimes the madness could be consuming, and like you kind of like lose your direction. And it's so funny you mentioned Candace from Walls of Jericho. First off, The American Dream is like my favorite hardcore album ever. Like, and interviewing her was like a bucket list thing back in 2018. And also their cover of House of the Rising Sun is the best, and I will die on that hill. But depending on what the lyrical subject matter could be about, though, does it maybe resonate with you when you perform it or revisit it, or maybe you channel a different energy depending if it's more of an internal source of inspiration versus an external source?
Like whenever I perform the songs? So before, it was kind of hard to find like a balance, because I really don't want to be somebody who's up there just kind of like just saying words. So I want it to be like, I guess, a more like authentic, like telling of the story that's behind the lyrics. But at the same time, like you said earlier, it is exhausting to constantly just be like, just like pulling everything to the forefront every single time you perform. So I try to find like a little bit of a balance. So there's usually certain phrases or lines in the song that I resonate more strongly with. And so usually, I would say I usually kind of go in and out like during a performance, where for certain lines I'm much more present, and then the rest of them I'm kind of just like, okay, I don't want to like blow my voice out. And so I'm like focusing on technique a lot of the time, just because I guess I've done it so many times. But But yeah, there is still a big part of me that that's like, I guess maybe trying not to cry or trying not to look at somebody too crazy, like in the middle of a song, if that makes any sense. But
No, it definitely does, and but like it's funny too because do you almost have to like mentally prepare yourself to engage with that side of you, or does the inspiration like do you, is there almost kind of like, for lack of better words, like a ritual or like a process, like whether it would be an
mhm.
exercise before you're going into that vocal booth, or do you just have to go right into it when the inspiration strikes?
For the vocal booth or for like stage? Because I think
Both.
those are probably right. So I'd say for stage, most of the time, I'm pretty prepared, and then I'm looking around. I'm like, okay, well, there's three other guys here that are about to do the same thing with me. Like, we're doing this together. It's kind of like almost like a little bit of like a family type of feeling. Like, we got this, guys. But there are times where, for whatever reason, I just feel a little bit more sensitive when I'm about to go on stage. And so I just have to walk away or go sit in the van and just like relax and kind of like maybe meditate a little bit, just because like maybe I'm just like in a little bit more of a little bit more of like, for lack of a better word, a vulnerable place. But for like recording vocals, I would say that it's always a lot more, I don't want to say awkward, but it's always feels a lot more like, I don't know, alone, I guess, because nobody else is getting in there with me and doing it. And then a lot of the time, like, it's kind of awkward thinking about, like, I have the headphones on and I can hear the track, but they're just going to hear me yelling. And it's kind of strange. So it is a little bit like maybe weird. And then, especially like, I want to be able to like record it the way that I heard it in my head or the way we've been doing it at practice or performing, because sometimes we'll perform certain songs before we record them. So it is a little bit of like a weird struggle in the vocal booth.
I'd imagine too, because like Capra, not to pigeonhole Capra by any means, but like you definitely have the hardcore sort of vibe behind it. When I introduce your music to people, I say you need to listen to this hardcore band; they're epic, and do see a lot of other elements in it too. But there's a lot of energy where like there's no static moment, whether you're playing live or whether I'm listening to the album. So do you think that maybe the studio is just 24/7 outside of your comfort zone because it's very static, it's very controlled, there's
Hmm.
really, I guess, no element of surprise, if you will, in a way. So do you feel like that maybe is almost kind of like the bigger obstacle when making an album, is sort of being in that environment?
I would say the recording for me is one of the scariest things I can do, because when I'm going live, I'm like, okay, well, I have this much percentage, kind of like, not to be super technical with it, but this much of the set left. I'm like maybe halfway or 60% through. So I can probably use my voice at like 40%, for the rest of the set, kind of thing. But whenever I'm recording, it's like you don't know how many times you're going to have to do a take. You don't know how many. It's just, you don't, there's not really like a clear and concise end to it. Like, you may know how many more songs you have to do, but you don't know how long it's going to take for each of those songs. So there's always this fear of like, I don't know how far to push myself, because I want it to sound as best as possible on the album. But at the same time, if I start losing my voice on the first day and then I have 2, 3 more days, or a few more days to record, I don't want the rest of the album to be with me not having a voice anymore. So it is a really scary process for me, because it's like, how exactly much do I not strain myself, but how much do I push myself to sound really good for the first couple of songs? Whenever I like, it's like I'd rather sound, I guess, not, I'd rather sound at 90% for all of the songs than sound at 100% for like three songs, and then at like maybe 40% for like the rest of the like 7 to 10 songs or something
Well,
like that.
and because every Capra song also really captures a moment in a way too. Like when I listen to "Loser," which is one of my favorite songs on the album, versus and another track like "Trauma Bond," another fantastic track. And
Those are
then,
probably my two favorites.
wow, you have excellent taste, I must say. But and then "Transplant" barely loses to the two as a number three. But your music captures a moment, and if you're working on a song for a long period of time, you have to practice it hours on end, and then take multiple takes in the studio. Does it maybe make it harder to sort of maintain that initial spark of the idea?
um, Really, no. And I'd say it's probably surprising how much. it still feels the same. Because if you listen to just like a song that you like, that's not something that you wrote. Eventually, like if you listen to it over and over, like, yeah, you still enjoy it, but maybe it doesn't feel the same as the first time you heard it. But with music that we're writing, I would say, if anything, I feel more of a spark the more we listen to it or the more we play it, because when I first write it, I always like feel maybe a little bit awkward about like listening to, and this is getting better, like this is something that I don't struggle with as much, but when you're listening to your own vocals or things that you like created yourself, like it feels a little awkward because it's like, oh, that's like me, but eventually, I think that the more I hear the song, the more I become confident with like what I wrote to it. And so it's kind of like, yeah, I'm like trusting myself, and I'm trusting what I wrote for it, and I'm trusting what I felt in that moment. So I'd say that actually the spark maybe grows a little bit.
Yeah, well, I've always said that art is life, and it grows and develops and whatnot. So I'd imagine that transmission is 2 years old now. So I'd imagine when you revisit those songs, there's a proficiency that you have behind it that you didn't have when you first released it or something like that. So
Right.
the spark, I think it goes from a spark to an ember to an inferno as you perform it more, right?
I would agree with that.
To get the creative energy though, to either write lyrics or get into the vocal state of mind, is that really something that you can seek out? Can you go and look for creative energy or go and look for inspiration, or does it just kind of have to strike you?
It's tough. I would say that there are days when you can, and there are days when you can't, because sometimes I just have like what am I going to write about today, or what am I going to write about for this song? And sometimes I can just sit and kind of just maybe meditate a little bit, and something comes to me, and then even if I don't write about that thing specifically, it can kind of start getting like a vocal, like not vocal, sorry, like a mental just chain of events that leads to something that I'm happy writing about. But there are some days where there is just like nothing you can do about, or me specifically, there's nothing I can do. I'll sit for like hours just closing my eyes, or just like trying to inspire myself. Or like for me, a big thing is like maybe watching a bunch of like horror movies, or just like listening to music that I like, and just nothing will come to me. Sometimes I think I'm just meant to just experience everything rather than create things. So I would say that it's definitely a 50-50 situation.
Have you ever thought about maybe, I don't know if this would maybe fly with Capra or not, but like, have you ever thought that maybe like a lyrical meaning, like, can you do something very fantasy oriented or something very, very like metaphorical in a way where like, you completely distance yourself from the music in a way, and you're almost kind of like narrating another storyline or narrating another narrative?
Right. So I like tried to do that actually on the previous album. There's a song called Paper Tongues that I like was like, okay, I'm just gonna write like for whatever reason we were talking about Lords of the Colossus, or not Lords of the Colossus, Shadow of the Colossus, that game. I don't know if you've ever played it, but in that game you have like a bunch of like these large like titan things that you like have to fight basically. And I was like, well, I'm just gonna write about like a song about like a boss fight with like a colossus, but I like it ended up totally becoming something different. So it is still kind of about that, but it's much more a metaphor for like an experience that I had in my own life instead. So it is still technically a boss fight, but it's just like no longer just like totally removed from my life. Like I feel like it's impossible for me to write something that isn't at least a little bit personal, even if it's just like a few lines. But
Yeah. Well, to quote the painter Henry Matisse, every painting is a self-portrait. So, but
true.
it's funny you mentioned that too. I interviewed Serena from the hardcore band from the UK, Svalbard. Fantastic, fantastic band. But she also has a black metal side project where she's singing about Skyrim, and she's probably going to do a video game for each album. So I think it's cool that maybe you could almost express different sides of yourself. You never know yet. So
Right. At least in this band, it's hard for me to do that, I guess.
yeah, never say never though. I'd love to see a hardcore.
Right.
I'd love to see a band sound as hardcore as Sick of It All, but have the lyrics of like a power metal band. I think that would
Right.
be like, really.
Yeah, that'd be different for sure.
Yeah, definitely get some heads rolling. And being that Capra is a band with incredibly talented individuals. I love the rhythm section in the band. The riffs just really pulverize you into the ground. I think every element of Capra really counts. Does everybody need to be in the same headspace emotionally when writing together? Do they, would they all have to maybe see things from your point of view, or do you kind of maybe have to put yourself in their shoes in order to make the song sound consistent? Or is it okay if maybe you're all in your different worlds and that could actually help add contrast to the sound?
That's a good question. I would say that we probably, well, I'm going to say as far as like me and guitar, like me and Tyler, we probably couldn't be like in a more different headspace. Like we just have very different thought processes, very different writing processes. And we're usually not together when we're writing or anything like that. Writing is just something that I do like by myself at home. But as far as when they're writing, like Trevor, Tyler, and Jeremy, they all kind of like do it together. Like Tyler will show up with like a few riffs or something that he was like just noodling around with at home, and then they'll all kind of just expand on that together. So there's a lot more I guess camaraderie in their writing process than there is with like mine specifically.
Do you think we'll ever, and this may not be the best question for you, but I ask everybody this now because a lot of people say, oh, it starts off with a riff. Do you think we'll ever run out of riffs one day?
When I was a kid, I like thought that there was only like a finite like number of sounds that could be like produced, and I just remember thinking like, when I'm an adult, like nobody can write songs anymore because they're going to run out of songs to write. I don't know. I think that even like looking back now, like there are a lot of songs that draw inspiration from each other, but or there are a lot of songs that have like the same riff and you just don't notice it because maybe like everything else is different, or like the surrounding riffs are different. So you kind of like don't even notice it until somebody points out like, hey, that's the chord progression from like this song too. It's like kind of crazy, but I don't know. I think there's almost like a beauty in that it's kind of like the what do you call it? The collective consciousness of people who maybe have never even heard each other's bands coming up with the same riff.
Yeah, and all the pop hits had the same four chords together.
True, right? That's yeah.
And I think repeating melodies. I don't know what it is, but I think it maybe triggers something of the psyche. Like one of my favorite albums to come out in the last couple of years was the last See You Space Cowboy album, The Romance of Affliction, and in like three choruses, they kind of have a same sort of melodic leeway into it, and like, they sound very similar, but then they lead to something different and have a different effect. So I think it's really fascinating. I feel like music is like the only art where you could like completely maybe like repeat yourself, but it's going to resonate in a different way. Almost kind of like if you're printing the same thing over and over again, it's eventually going to be kind of different.
Right. I agree with you like 100% on that.
Mm-hmm. And the final question I wanted to ask you is the most difficult one. How do you know when you're finished with a song?
So for me, I think it's like probably a little bit easier because, well, maybe not. I'd say it's more easy than instrumentation because, they don't know like how much to put in or how much to add or when to start and stop. But for me, there's a specific beginning and a specific ending of the song. And all I have to do is just like add things to that. So eventually there runs out of room for me to put things. I will say there are certain songs where I try to put way too much in it. Deadbeat Assailant from the first album was a song that like now every time we play it live, I'm like, why did I do this? Why did I do this? Because I have like very little room for breathing. And it's just like, that song is like rough to do live. So that's why a lot of the time before we play that song live, if it's in our set list, I'll just look at everybody and just go, what the fuck? Why am I doing this again? But I'd say like usually it was a little bit more difficult to balance out like not putting too much and like having just enough. And there are certain parts of the songs now that I like to just let rest. So if there's like, which I say that, but probably there's not a whole lot of me doing that in the album. But usually during a song, I like there to be some little breaths because I feel like if you're just being hammered with lyrics the entire way through, I feel like sometimes maybe they don't have as strong a meaning, or maybe the emotion isn't translated as well. So if you have just like a little bit of time to like just kind of like hear just like the instrumentation and not just like have words thrown at you, I feel like maybe it just like resonates a little bit better. But like I said, I feel like maybe I didn't even do that on the new album, so we'll just see. I don't even remember.
You could tell me there's been plenty of moments where like you've had like the best lyrics ever, and then they're always like one syllable or over like every arrangement, right?
100%. It's been so frustrating. And there'll be times where I'm sitting trying to make it work, trying to make it fit. And I'm like, there's just no way to do it. I'm just going to have to move it somewhere else and it's not going to have the same effect. But yeah, that definitely happens.
Kill your darlings. It's the unfortunately one of the worst, but necessary aspects of the creative process. But there was
Right.
one more question I forgot to ask, and we touched upon it before, and that was, from in transmission to errors. Again, a fantastic evolution, like really impressive. With evolution as an artist, every artist evolves one way or another. Even if you are a band like ACDC, that's kind of like been putting out, there's always evolution. Does an artist, or even just a human being in general, do you feel like that they have control over their evolution? Do you think your evolution is something you can dictate, or does that just kind of have to happen subconsciously and you can't really acknowledge it too much?
A little bit, yeah. I think that you can definitely affect, like, or you can definitely have a choice on like what you surround yourself with and your environment, things like that. And that definitely has an effect on like who you kind of grow to be as a person. But I also think a lot of it does come from within. So something that like I would compare to that is like trying to find like your voice whenever you're a vocalist. And it's something that I think probably every vocalist struggles with is like maybe when you first start out, you're trying really hard to like sound like certain vocalists because that's all you know how to do. But then you find that like whenever you start focusing more on like technique rather than just like inspiration, then you start finding like what your voice is supposed to sound like, and you can still change like maybe the style of the vocals you do, or like you do have some sort of say in how it sounds, but for the most part, your voice is still your voice, and there's not really anything you can do about that. And I think that has something to do with, or it's very similar when you think of evolution as an artist, in my opinion.
Having your own signature voice is like a great advantage and disadvantage at the same time. It's such a double-edged sword because like I
True.
love vocalists like Mike Patton who could like, do death metal but then also do like ballads and love songs. But then which is awesome, but I know plenty of people who love Faith No More, can't stand Mr. Bungle or so on and so forth. And like but then you have a vocalist like George Corpse Grinder Fisher, fantastic, one of the best death metal vocalists ever. But and I mean, and I'm not to say that he didn't evolve, but it's not like he could take that drastic of a change from Vile to the new record. It still has to be pulverizing death metal. So there's
Right,
always
right.
like a double-edged sword in that regard.
Hmm.
So
For sure.
before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show. Most of all, thank you for another fantastic album. Is there just anything else with Capra that you'd like to promote with the release of Errors in terms of tours, if you're allowed to say at this time, of course?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when this is going to be released or anything, but
Midnight
we
tonight.
okay. I mean, well, yeah, I don't think we have anything right now that I can't talk about. So, but we are about to leave this weekend with for a tour with Zayo and Your Spirit Dies, and we'll be gone for like it's a little over a week, so it's not a super long one, just around the states. And so we're excited about that one. On this tour, we're playing Louder Than Life, and there's like so many bands that I'm really excited to catch on that. So we were lucky to be added kind of last minute. And then we have Dia de los Deftones, which is coming up in November. And then, which we're really excited about. I mean, that's going to be an incredible show. And there's like a bunch of really, really cool acts on it that it's kind of insane to think that I'm going to be sharing a stage with. And then I don't know if I'm forgetting anything. We just have some other like one-off shows after that. But we're planning a lot for like next year. So definitely like keep an ear open because we'll be announcing like all of that stuff within the next few months.
Louder Than Life is awesome. I covered it in 2019, and it was just a
Oh, nice.
fantastic festival. Bring lots of water because it gets real hot out there.
I believe it. Yeah, I believe
I
it.
think it was like 107 when I was there the first day or something like that.
Yeah, that's gonna be great.
Yep. Enjoy. You're gonna kill it. But thank
Yeah,
you.
woohoo.
And you're going on early when the sun is like right there, so that'll add some.
Perfect.
It'll add some fire to the performance. But
Right.
thank you so much, everybody. We are
Yeah,
here.
thank you.
We are here with Capra. Be sure to check out Errors coming out via Metal Blade Records very soon. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.
Bye.